There are known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. But there are also unknown knowns. The ancient and esoteric Order of the Jackalope is a secret society devoted to unearthing and sharing this forgotten knowledge. Each episode, we take one of these strange stories and share it with you. No topic is off limits, except for the obvious. Initiates, it's true what they say. You never know how much you miss the podcast bunker until you spend time away from it. And let me tell you, after 2 weeks on the road in the fresh air and sun, taking in the natural splendor of our country along with its fanciest museums and dingiest roadside tourist traps... Wait, why do I miss the podcast bunker again? Anyway, this is the start of our 11th series, and you know what that means. Yep, it's a fresh envelope full of cassettes from the Grand Jackalope and our friends over at That's Not Canon Productions. I wonder who we're promoting this week.
Hi, I'm Travis.
And I'm Serge, and we are the hosts of Now That's Interesting podcast.
Here we talk about the topics that catch our interest and hopefully spark your curiosity to dig deeper into the world around you.
We go into enough detail to get a better understanding of the topic we cover.
Say just a bit above your average pub chat.
We talk about everything from conspiracy theories here on Earth to rovers on Mars and everything in between.
Find us on whichever platform you get your podcast fix.
Folks, this is going to be a long, depressing episode. So pour yourself a stiff drink and settle in. You'll need it. Me? I'm drinking a Greyhound. Or as close to a Greyhound as I could get from the liquor cabinet here. So, ruby red squirt mixed with Howler Head banana bourbon. Don't you judge me. I know it's bad. And anyways, the bylaws say only the Grand Jackalope can judge. Trigger warning, this is a true crime story, and the victim is a very young child. If that's too much for you to handle, why not go listen to our episode on the history of peanut butter instead? It's fun and informative, and no one gets hurt. Your Heart's Sorrow, presented by Number 13. It was quiet. Too quiet. That's what Christian K. Ross thought as he made his way home on the evening of Wednesday, July 1st, 1874. He'd been expecting some quiet. After all, the family home in Philadelphia's Germantown neighborhood was situated on secluded Washington Lane, set back from the hustle and bustle of Germantown Avenue and the din of the Chestnut Hill Railroad station. Also, there was hardly anyone there since the household had started to disperse for the summer. His ailing wife Sarah Ann had decamped to Atlantic City in the hopes that the sea air would improve her health, and had taken their 6-year-old daughter Sophia Lewis with her. Their 2 oldest children, 10-year-old Augustus Stoughton and 8-year-old Henry Augustus, had been sent off to spend the summer with their grandparents in Middletown near Harrisburg. His 2 youngest children were still at home, but 2-year-old Marion Kimball and 1-year-old Anne Christine were just sweet young babes. That left the couple's middle children, 5-year-old Walter Lewis and 4-year-old Charles Brewster. They were well-behaved young boys, but let's be honest, they were still young boys. Ross should have heard them playing as he came down the street. Instead, he heard nothing. He was a little disappointed. He'd hauled a heavy cart of sand back from his office in Center City so the boys would have something to launch firecrackers into on the 4th of July. He had been eagerly anticipating Walter and Charlie's squeals of delight, and now? Denied. Still, there was no reason to worry. It was the era of free-range parenting, after all. The boys were probably just playing out of earshot in the empty lot next door. Ross settled into a chair on the porch, unfolded his copy of the evening newspaper, and asked the maid to bring him some tea. When Ross finally looked up from the junior jumble and realized that his tea was cold and the sun was going down, he started to get worried. He got off the porch and started walking up and down the street searching for the boys. Mrs. Kidder from across the way told him that she had seen the boys ride off in a wagon with 2 strangers, a young man, round-faced and broad-shouldered, with glasses and a red mustache, who was driving the wagon, and an older man with a full sandy beard, thinning a bit on top, who kept holding a handkerchief over his face. Every now and then the man would drop the handkerchief to speak, revealing a strangely shaped nose, flared and flattened and pushed up. Ross was familiar with the men, if only by reputation. They had driven down the street a few days previously and given Walter and Charley enormous chunks of red and white ribbon candy. When Walter mentioned the incident at dinner, Ross told his sons not to take candy from strangers. Apparently, they hadn't been listening. Suddenly, Ross was startled by the sight of Walter being led down the lane by a complete stranger. The man introduced himself as Henry Peacock, a railroad worker. He had found Walter bawling his eyes out on a street corner clear across the city in Kensington, near the Shackamaxon Street ferry, and had taken the rest of the afternoon off work to escort the lost child home. As for Walter, he had quite the story to tell. Earlier that day, as he and Charley were playing in the street, the strange men had come back around in their wagon. Actually, they'd been by multiple times in the previous week to the point where their visits had become routine. Typically, they'd dole out a few hunks of candy and start asking questions. Is that big house yours? Is your mommy pretty? Is your daddy rich? Is anyone else home right now? Today, though, they had a new question. You boys want to go get some firecrackers? They did. They very much did. So they hopped into the wagon and off they went to get firecrackers. The children had first assumed that they were just going down to the general store on Main Street, but no, the men said, we know where to get them cheaper. Well, wherever that was, it wasn't close. The wagon took a convoluted route that went all over the city. The longer the trip took, the more upset young Charley got. To placate the young boy, the men stopped next to a corner store, and the man with the monkey nose gave Walter a shiny new quarter and told him to run in and get some torpedoes for Charley. When Walter emerged a few minutes later, the wagon was gone. That's when Henry Peacock found him crying his eyes out. Walter wasn't sad, though. He was upset that he'd been left behind. He didn't even realize Charley was in danger. Christian K. Ross, though, was thrown into a blank panic. For 3 sleepless days and nights, he retraced the route Walter described and scoured the streets of Germantown and Kensington looking for Charley. At various times he was helped by the police, his in-laws, and the sainted Henry Peacock. He was able to get more detailed descriptions of the abductors from neighbors and visitors, but couldn't find any trace of the wagon and its occupants after it left Kensington. The police were surprisingly unhelpful. They were dismissive of Ross's concerns, suggesting that the 2 boys had just been picked up by some skylarking drunks and that Charley would be returned after they sobered up. They were happy to contribute to the search in their own unique way, by harassing hobos and tramps. It had nothing to do with the case, mind you, but it was something they liked to do. With no solid leads to follow up on, Ross took the only step he could. He took out ads in Philadelphia's 2 biggest newspapers, offering a reward for the safe return of his child.
$300 reward. $300 will be paid for the return to number 304 Market Street, Philadelphia, of a small boy aged 4 years named Charley Brewster Ross. He is dressed in a brown linen suit, with short skirt, a broad-brimmed unbleached Panama hat, with black ribbon and laced shoes, and blue and white striped stockings. He has long flaxen curly hair, hazel eyes, clear skin, round full face, is well-formed, and without any marks except those made by vaccination on the arm. Charley and his brother got into a wagon with 2 men on Washington Lane near Chew Street, Germantown, to take a ride between 4 and 5 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon, July 1st. The eldest boy was found at Palmer and Richmond Streets, but Charley, the younger, is still missing. The above reward will be paid for his return to my store, as above, or for any information which shall lead to his recovery. Christian K. Ross, number 304 Market Street.
On Saturday, July 4th, Christian K. Ross received a letter in the mail confirming his worst fears. The spelling and grammar were atrocious, but the message was crystal clear.
July 3rd, Mr. Ross, be not uneasy, you son Charley Brewster be all writ, we is got him, and no powers on earth can deliver out of our hand. You will have to pay us before you get him from us, and pay us a big cent. To if you put the cops hunting for him, you is only defeating you own end. We is got him fixed so no living power can get him from us alive. If any approach is made to his hiding place, that is the signal for his instant annihilation. If you regard his life puts no one to search for him, you money can fetch him out alive, and no other existing powers. Don't deceive yourself and think the detectives can get him from us, for that is one impossible. You hear from us in a few days.
2 days later, on July 6th, he got the promised follow-up.
Mr. Ross, we suppose you go the other letter that told you we had ye child all safe and sound. You might offer $1 million. It would avail you nothing. To be plain with you, you might invoke all the powers of the universe, and that could not get you child from us. We set God, man, and devil at defiance to wrest him out of our hands. This is the lever that moved the rock that hides him from you, $20,000. Not $1 less. Impossible, impossible. You cannot get him without it. If you love money more than child, you be its murderer. Not us for the money we'll have. If we don't get from you, we be sure to get it from someone else, for we will make example of your child that others may be wiser. When you get ready to business with us, advertise the following in ledger personals. Ross, we be ready to negotiate. We look for you answer in ledger.
There was just one problem with the kidnappers' demands. Christian K. Ross didn't have $20,000. To provide some context, that's about $500,000 in 2022 money. At the time, the annual salary of Ulysses S. Grant was only $25,000 a year, and he was the President of the United States. Christian K. Ross was just a humble dry goods wholesaler. Ross wasn't even capable of scraping the money together on short notice. The Panic of 1873 had done a real number on the firm of Ross, Schott & Company. In fact, the only thing keeping the wolves at bay was Ross's reputation for fair dealing and honesty, which allowed him to negotiate generous terms with his creditors to keep the lights on. When it came to his personal finances, he was getting a lot of assistance from his wife family, the Lewises. Still, what could he do? He had to get his boy back, so he took out the requested personal ad in the ledger as instructed.
Ross, we be ready to negotiate.
A third letter arrived on July 7th, with more instructions and threats.
The only answer we want from ye now be is why willing to pay $20,000 to save Charley. If you love you money more than him, his blood be upon you, and not us, for we'll show him up to you either dead or alive. It is left with you. Answer the following in Evening Herald or Star. Ross will come to terms. Ross will not come to terms.
Ross tried to provide a nuanced picture of his financial situation in his response, though the medium of newspaper personals was perhaps not entirely suited to the task.
Ross will come to terms to the extent of his ability.
That drew an indignant response on July 9th.
Ross, we is set your price. We ask no more. We takes no less. We know the extent you ability. How much time you want to obtain this money. You is only in part answered our question. The only question for you to answer is you got it and be willing to pay it, then we will proceed to business at once. Is it necessary to repeat the fatal consequences of delay and to give time to find his hiding place?
Clearly, nuance was off the table. Ross did the only thing he could. He caved.
Ross, I is ready to negotiate.
While Christian Ross conducted negotiations with the kidnappers through the personals, the Philadelphia police sprung into action. That mostly meant rounding up the usual suspects, searching every abandoned building in town, hassling anyone traveling with a small child, chasing down everyone who'd rented a wagon in the previous month, and of course, beating up hobos. As usual, it was not helpful at all. At this point, the newspapers got involved. They had learned that Charley was missing when Ross walked into their offices to take out his first reward notice, but now the massive police response and cryptic personal ads had tipped him off to the fact that he'd been kidnapped. European-style kidnapping for ransom was virtually unknown in the United States at the time. In fact, this was the first documented case in the country's history. The public was fascinated, and the newspapers fed that interest by writing article after article after article about the case. Their coverage was indiscriminate, to say the least. Several early stories mentioned that the police were watching the Central Post Office to try and catch the criminals when they mailed their ransom notes. Suddenly, those ransom notes became few and far between, and were no longer being posted from the central office, but at tiny stations way down the line, or even from other cities and states entirely. The Philadelphia police politely asked the newspapers to back off before they lost all of their leads. Some of them, like the Ledger, did. Others, like the Inquirer, did not. The police responded by shutting down all official lines of communications with the press, and the press responded by running their own parallel investigations. The overlapping deluge of official and unofficial information just wound up confusing the general public, and eventually, even the kidnappers and the Ross family. The New York papers were the worst of the lot. Since they had few connections in Philadelphia, they were reduced to publishing baseless speculation and angry op-eds attacking the police and Ross family for coddling the criminals. They had no actual idea what was going on behind the scenes, which was probably for the best because behind the scenes it was unmitigated chaos. The kidnappers had finally twigged to the fact that maybe 4- and 5-year-olds didn't necessarily have detailed knowledge of their household finances. Now they realized the Rosses were almost bankrupt, but instead of lowering their ransom demands, they just told the Rosses to beg, borrow, and steal from friends and family. Meanwhile, Christian K. Ross had been trying to keep the worst of the bad news from his sick wife, lest she have a nervous breakdown, only to wind up having a nervous breakdown himself. To save his sanity, he wound up handing over control of the negotiations to an advisory committee composed of Mayor William S. Stokely, William V. McCain, managing editor of the Public Ledger, George L. Harrison of the Board of Public Charities, and prominent lawyer John C. Bullitt. This was a huge mistake. The advisory committee was not interested in the safety and well-being of Charley Brewster Ross. It was only interested in the perception of public safety and the maintenance of law and order. The city was deep in preparations for the 1876 Philadelphia World's Fair and Centennial Exposition. Who would come to see that if they thought the city was a crime-ridden cesspool? The advisory committee somehow convinced Christian Ross to turn down anyone offering to help with the ransom, including at least 2 millionaires who offered to just give him the money, no strings attached. The committee did raise $20,000, but it wasn't for the ransom. It was a reward for information leading to the return of the child and capture of the kidnappers. The advisory committee's long-term plan was to string the kidnappers along, either until they slipped up or were caught, or until the police dragnet made them cut bait and run. They ignored the one thing the kidnappers had made sure to drill into Ross's head from the start. Without the ransom, Charley was dead meat. It was regrettable, but understandable. They needed to show the families of potential victims that they meant business. That the kidnappers were serious never seemed to occur to the committee members. At least part of their plan was working. The police were certainly making things very uncomfortable for the kidnappers. They apparently had to relocate further out from the city, slowing the frequency of their correspondence to 1 letter every few days. The ransom notes were getting longer and longer, and the threats more pointed. The grammar and spelling also improved, which suggested that they were now being written by someone else, or perhaps that the semi-literate style of the earlier notes was a put-on. The kidnappers showed an utter bafflement at the conflicting messages they were getting from Ross, the advisory committee, and the press.
Ross, we be at a loss to understand you. A week ago, why said you had the amount and was willing to pay it. The editorial seemed to speak as if the money was yet to be contributed before you could pay it. This would be a terrible mistake for you.
Then, on July 18th, the police suddenly announced that they had captured one of the kidnappers. Chris Wooster, a confidence man and thief who had been in and out of jail so often he was on a first-name basis with every cop on the force. They had no specific evidence against Wooster, mind you, but had a plan to beat the tar out of him until he told them what they wanted to hear. It worked and it didn't. Wooster confessed that he had been planning to kidnap a child, but abandoned the idea because it was too dangerous. Besides, he had an ironclad alibi. He'd been laid up for 2 weeks with injuries sustained in a bar brawl. The police reluctantly released Wooster, who then gave a dynamite interview to the papers where he offered his professional opinion that both sides were dragging this thing out for far too long. He suggested that they could effect an exchange at Niagara Falls, so the Rosses could have their boy back and the criminals could be safe from extradition on the Canadian side of the border. A few days later, Wooster tried to capitalize on his 15 minutes of fame by renting a theater and selling tickets to a lecture about his experience. When the curtain went up, though, the only people in the seats were 3 bored cub reporters, a sozzled liquor salesman, a pickpocket, and the friend who'd loaned him the money to rent the theater. So he called off the lecture tour, and they all went off to get drunk instead. Charley had now been missing for 3 weeks, and in case you couldn't tell, things were starting to get crazy. People were finding Charley Ross everywhere. At one point, the police claimed to have finally found the boy, only to awkwardly backtrack when it turned out it was a different Charley Ross who was at least 4 years too old. A Charlie Gross was picked up at the circus when someone misheard his name, as was a Charley Loss in Frankfurt, who people mistakenly thought was speaking with a lisp. Street urchins from Gloucester, Camden, and Vineland, New Jersey were briefly put forward as the missing boy, though they didn't match his description at all. Other Charlies popped up in Westchester, Reading, Harrisburg, Shamokin, and Waynesburg. He even showed up further afield in Washington, D.C., Goshen and Hillsdale, New York, New Haven, Connecticut, Bennington, Vermont, Barbersville, West Virginia, Chester and Odell, Illinois, St. Catharines, Ontario, McCullough, Nebraska, and Denver, Colorado. Christian K. Ross and his family tried to personally verify each and every one, process was expedited by a simple trick. They withheld Charley's actual eye color from the press, which made it easy to cut through a sea of blonde-haired, blue-eyed pretenders. Still, it didn't help that no one had a real idea of what the boy looked like. The only photo of Charley had been taken when he was 2, and he looked very different now. So there were blonde Charley Rosses and brunette Charley Rosses and redheaded Charley Rosses. There were German Charley Rosses and Italian Charley Rosses and Cuban Charley Rosses. There was even a Charley Ross whose only physical similarity to the missing Charley Ross was that he was also wearing a straw hat and a brown linen suit. At one point, the deluge of ersatz Charley Rosses got so bad that Christian Ross carried around a stack of pre-printed certificates that mothers could show to the police to prove that their child had already been investigated and no, he wasn't Charley Ross. The Philadelphia police still had no leads, so they ratcheted things up to the next level, conducting an unprecedented and entirely unconstitutional door-to-door search of the entire city. There were so many cops combing the streets, the crime rate actually dropped to 0 for a few weeks. It was great for law and order, but in the end it was all for naught. There was still no sign of Charley anywhere. The papers were still speculating wildly, claiming that Charley had been kidnapped by gypsies to swell their ranks, or by comprachos who planned to torture the boy and turn him into a deformed circus freak. Never mind that comprachos didn't actually exist. They were something Victor Hugo had dreamed up to add some color to his 1869 novel The Man Who Laughs. Completely unrelated, Batman aficionados may remember that the novel's protagonist, Gwynplaine, is one of the inspirations for the Joker. The Reading Daily Eagle was probably the worst of the lot. It published a lengthy article claiming that Ross's respectability was just a front. He was secretly a degenerate, drunk, and filthy gambler, and the kidnapping was part of a revenge plot orchestrated by his vindictive ex-wife. Not a word of it was true, and the Daily Eagle was forced to fork over a hefty settlement to Christian Ross after the subsequent libel trial. At this point, the grief-stricken Christian and Sarah Ross were largely cut off from the day-to-day business of the investigation, making them easy targets for the hordes of spiritualists, dowsers, and powwowers who showed up at their door offering to help. As you might expect, they all proved to be useless. For their part, the kidnappers kept up a steady stream of correspondence. As the weeks wore on, they became increasingly obsessed with finding a way of conducting the exchange without getting followed by the police. On July 30th, they unveiled their master plan for the exchange.
Ross, you are to take the 12 p.m. train tonight from Westville for New York. It arrives at New York 5:05 a.m. Take a cab at Cortlandt or Disbrosser Streets, New York, and ride directly to the Grand Central Station at 4 Ave and 42nd Streets. Take the 8 a.m. Northern Express by way of Hudson River. Take notice, you are to stand on the rear car and rear platform from the time you leave West Philly Depot until you arrive at Jersey City. You are then to stand on the rear platform of the Hudson River car from the time you leave the Grand Central at New York until you arrive at Albany. If our agent do not meet you before you arrive in Albany, you will find a letter in post office at Albany addressed to C.K. Walter, directing you to where you are to then go. Ross, the probability is you may not go 1 mile before our agent meets you, and yet you may go 25 miles before he intercepts you. But be it where it may, you must be prepared to throw the valise to him regardless of all risks. The risk of being lost we assume, and you get your child without fail. These are the signals. If it be dark the moment the rear car passes him, he will exhibit a bright torch in one hand and a white flag in the other. But if it be light, he will ring a bell with one hand and a white flag in the other hand. The instant you see either of these signals, you are to drop it on the track, and you may get out at the next station. If the cars continue on their course, we consider you have kept your word, and your child shall be returned to you safe. But if they stop to arrest our agent, then your child's fate is sealed. This letter ends all things in regard to the restoration of your child.
Christian Ross followed these convoluted instructions to the letter. The kidnappers did not. It turns out they had called off their man when they saw an article in the Ledger claiming Ross had gone to Pottsville to check out another fraudulent Charley Ross there. Except the reports in the papers were lagging a day behind, and it was Frank Lewis and not Christian Ross who'd gone to check. Whoops. It was probably for the best anyway. Ross's valise wasn't packed full of $20,000 in small unmarked bills. In fact, the only thing inside was a letter from the advisory committee telling the kidnappers that their plan was garbage and insisting on a simultaneous exchange. If that note had made its way to the kidnappers, they probably would have killed Charley just out of spite. The kidnappers remained adamantly opposed to the idea of a simultaneous exchange. They proposed a simpler plan, just sending a messenger to Ross's store to pick up the cash, but the advisory committee shot that down too. The advisory committee was really starting to feel its oats and get downright punchy. They insisted that the kidnappers switch up the aliases used to communicate in the personals, which were starting to attract copycats. Then they insisted that the kidnappers stop using the personals altogether and appoint an attorney or some other intermediary to negotiate on their behalf. Then they began demanding proof, any proof, that Charley was still alive and in their custody. In mid-August, the kidnappers stopped writing back. The newspapers continued to report on the case with a breathless report of no news every day, which was mostly devoted to covering other newspapers' breathless reports of no news. The Ledger criticized the Inquirer, which criticized the Evening Star, which criticized the Herald, and so on. It was like the blogosphere, with everyone talking in circles. The coverage took up an entire column every day, which is a lot of space to devote to no news when your paper is only 8 pages long on average. In an attempt to shut down the baseless speculation, the police finally shared the kidnappers' letters with reporters. It worked, and the speculation came to an end. Of course, it was now immediately replaced by criticism of how the police were handling the case. Entirely justified, of course, but it still had to be hard to hear. By now, Christian K. Ross had run out of patience with the advisory committee.
The public were clamorous for the arrest and punishment of the kidnappers at any cost, yet were ignorant of the risk to the life of my child and the consequent terror to which I was subjected. It is comparatively easy to sacrifice another man's child for the public good, and my anxious suspense was easier conceived than borne.
He started to take matters back into his own hands. With donations from concerned citizens and well-wishers, he hired the Pinkertons to take on the case. The Pinkertons soon turned out to be even more useless than the Philadelphia police, charging a hefty fee to little more than hang up posters and stand on street corners passing out handbills. The kidnappers resurfaced once again in late August. They refused to provide the physical proof the committee demanded, realizing it could be easily traced. Instead, they gave a detailed description of their escape route that matched the one Walter remembered, along with a host of tiny details that would have been unknown to outsiders, like a detailed description of Charley's outfit and the fact that he had lost his straw hat in Trenton. The advisory committee seized on a few minor discrepancies in their letter as an excuse to stonewall and demand even more proof. They still seemed to think that their delaying tactics would win out in the end. They didn't get an answer because in early September the kidnappers went silent again. About the same time, Chris Wooster re-entered the story when the police found him poking around with a shovel in the basement of 820 Knox Street in Philadelphia. He said he was searching for Charley Ross and had permission from the district attorney to do so. He didn't, and wasn't. In fact, he was just trying to break through the cellar wall to rob the house next door. He was promptly arrested. Astonishingly, the police did discover the body of a child in the basement, but it was a stillborn baby that had been buried the previous year by a grieving mother. Wooster also re-entered the story in another unexpected way. When the kidnappers finally resumed correspondence on September 25th, they mentioned that they'd gone to Canada to investigate the cross-border exchange Wooster had proposed way back in July. It turns out it wasn't a great plan. It was true that Canada would not extradite you just for kidnapping. The subsequent extortion, though, was a completely different matter. The kidnappers seemed very eager to get this whole business over with. To that end, they proposed a vastly simplified exchange. No more dicking around with elaborate spy stuff. Instead, they suggested that Ross should just take the $20,000 ransom to a hotel in New York, any hotel in New York, and then take out a personal ad letting the kidnappers know which one. One of their agents would quietly come by and pick up the money, and 10 hours later, Charley would be returned. Simple. Hard to mess up. The weary Rosses agreed to the exchange, overriding the objections of the police and the advisory committee. It took over a month of slow, tedious haggling to gather the money and work out the fine details. What date would they make the exchange? What pseudonym they would use in the personals? If it would be acceptable to send Frank Lewis if Christian Ross was ill, etc., etc. But finally, the day arrived.
Saul of Tarsus, 5th Avenue Hotel, Wednesday, 18th instant all day.
Frank Lewis waited in the 5th Avenue Hotel all day on November 18th. No one showed. Hardly surprising, really, since the lobby of the hotel was packed with undercover New York police officers, and the street was obviously receiving extra patrols. The Rosses took out one more personal ad.
Saul of Tarsus, we have performed our part to the letter. You have again broken faith. We will have no more trifling. Action must now be simultaneous.
But that was it. No one ever heard from the kidnappers again. Oh, the story's not over. I just needed a drink. Let's get back to it, shall we? On December 14, 1874, in the wee hours of the morning, a small boat dropped anchor just off the coast of Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. Its occupants were two seasoned river pirates, looking for an easy score at the poorly guarded houses of the wealthy that lined the beach. First, they tried breaking into a house owned by an elderly widow, but thought better of it when her manservant started to stir inside. Then they moved down the beach to easier pickings at the home of Judge Roulette Van Brunt. Lucky for them, the judge wasn't home. Unlucky for them, the judge was also paranoid AF, and had set up a burglar alarm that went off in the home of his brother Holmes next door. Nephew Albert and two hired hands trudged over to investigate and realized someone was rooting around inside. They took up positions outside and let the intruders know they were surrounded. The burglars panicked when they realized they were trapped. They fired off a few warning shots to try and clear their path as they made a break for the cellar door. After they broke through, the Van Brunts took their shots, and they weren't warnings. Both men were struck in the back as they fled. The older of the two burglars screamed, "I give up!" as he fell and died almost immediately. The younger one was knocked down, but managed to struggle into a seated position and ask for some whiskey. An indignant Mrs. Van Brunt retorted,
Whiskey for him? For the man who tries to kill my husband? Oh no, I don't want him to live. Let him die. At all events, he gets no whiskey from me.
For about 15 minutes, the Van Brunts interrogated the burglar, who refused to answer their questions. At some point, though, he realized he'd been mortally wounded and decided to end his life with a clean conscience.
Man, I won't lie to you. My name is Joseph Douglas, and that man over there is William Mosher. Mosher. Mosher lives in the city, and I have no home. I am a single man and have no relatives except a brother and sister, who I have not seen for 12 or 15 years. Mosher is a married man and has 5 children. I have $40 in my pocket. I wish to be buried with it. I made it honestly. It's no use lying now. Mosher and I stole Charley Ross from Germantown.
What now? The Van Brunts began pestering Douglas for more information, but he brushed off their inquiries with,
Mosher knows all about the child. Ask him.
The Van Brunts mentioned that would be difficult, since Mosher was currently very, dead. To which Douglas replied,
God help his poor wife and family. God knows I tell you the truth. I don't know where he is. Mosher knew. Superintendent Walling knows all about us, and was after us, and now he shall have us. Send him word. The child will be returned home safe and sound in a few days.
With that, he fell silent. 15 minutes later, he was dead. A few days later, Walter Ross was brought up from Philadelphia to take a look at the bodies. He recognized his abductors at once. After all, it was hard to forget a face like Bill Mosher's. The bridge of his nose had caved in on itself, thanks to either syphilis or cancer, giving it a distinctive pushed-up appearance. A monkey nose, if you will. So, what's all this about the New York Police Department knowing everything? Let's back up a bit. At the beginning of August, the Philadelphia Police Department received a telegram from Superintendent George Washington Walling of the New York Police Department telling them about a breakthrough in the Charley Ross case. An old fellow named Clinton Gilbert Mosher had heard the description of the kidnappers and thought the man with the monkey nose sounded a lot like his younger brother Bill, and his accomplice sounded a lot like Bill's known associate, Joseph Douglas. Bill Mosher was born in Greenpoint, Brooklyn in 1822. As a teenager, he and his brother Gil were members of the notoriously violent Daybreak Boys gang, and as adults they graduated to full-on river piracy. In the late 1840s, they made a few abortive attempts to go straight, including a few years spent running an oyster bar on Grant Street. They always wound up returning to piracy, though. Eventually, arguments about money drove the two brothers apart, and Bill began teaming up with a former juvenile delinquent named Joseph Douglas. The two made an effective team who could strike anywhere along the coast from Connecticut to New Jersey. They were caught every now and then, but never did serious time. On one notable occasion in 1870, Douglas even sprang Mosher from the pokey in Red Bank by ripping the entire wall off the jail in the middle of the night. In early 1874, Bill tried to reconcile with his brother and recruit him for a new job he was planning. He and Douglas were going to kidnap one of Commodore Vanderbilt's many grandchildren and ransom him back for $50,000. The job sounded too risky for Gil, who begged off. When the Charley Ross kidnapping happened a few months later, it sure sounded like a trial run for the big show to Gil. The description of the kidnappers clinched it. When the city of Philadelphia offered a $20,000 reward for information that led to Charley's return, Gil went straight to the cops. He could use the money, and revenge on his brother was just a nice bonus. Gil gave the cops a lot of useful information. He gave them Bill and Joe's real names, current aliases, and last known residences. He told them the duo had a sideline as traveling salesmen touting an insecticide called Mothy, which gave them a good excuse to take their wagon into wealthy neighborhoods and case homes. And he also told them they had been in Philadelphia early in the summer. Old Gil also pointed the cops towards another potential informant, William Westervelt. Westervelt was a former policeman who'd been kicked off the force for turning a blind eye to illegal gambling activity. Since then, he'd been working with his brother-in-law Bill Mosher selling Mothy. In fact, he'd only gotten back from Philadelphia a month or two earlier when he'd found another job in New York. Westervelt was a much more palatable informant to the police. They would rather get their intelligence from a disgraced ex-cop than a shifty ex-con. So Superintendent Walling approached Westervelt and tried to get him to flip. Westervelt was willing to play along on two conditions. First, he didn't want to be directly responsible for his brother-in-law's arrest. Though if Mosher happened to be swept up in Douglas's arrest, he could live with that. And second, he wanted his old job back. Walling agreed. He had no real intention of coming through on either account, but he figured that at the end of the day, Westervelt wouldn't be in a position to object. Now, you would think that with both Gil Mosher and William Westervelt feeding them inside information, the cops would have had Bill Mosher and Joseph Douglas in custody in no time flat. But the two criminals always seemed to be a step or two ahead. If the cops staged a raid on Mosher's apartment, it would turn out he'd moved just a few days earlier. If they got a hot tip that the duo would be on the Staten Island ferry, they wouldn't be there. The police were frustrated, but took some solace from the increasingly desperate tone of the kidnappers' letters. It was a clear sign that the noose was tightening around Mosher's neck, and it was only a matter of time until he slipped up. In one sense, they were right. With no ransom forthcoming, Mosher and Douglas started to run low on ready cash. They had to fall back on their old tricks, going on a robbery spree in the Narrows in late November and early December. And then on December 14th, they got shot. Douglas's dying confession answered a few questions, but left a few very troubling ones dangling. If the police had known about these guys for months, why was the public only hearing about them now? How had they managed to hide for so long in a city where they were known felons, being actively hunted by the law? The ransom notes had mentioned that there were 4 kidnappers. Who were the other 2? And most importantly, where was Charley Ross? Suspicions immediately fell on Gil Mosher, William Westervelt, and Martha Westervelt Mosher. They denied any knowledge of where the boy was. Martha suggested that maybe he was hiding out with friends of Douglas's in Baltimore, but could provide no further information about who those friends might be. The police and press remained confident that Charley would be home by Christmas, though. They figured that the boy was in the hands of accomplices who knew nothing about the case, who could be relied on to do the right thing in the end. Christian K. Ross tried to sweeten the pot by offering a $5,000 reward for Charley's safe return. No questions asked. Christmas came and went, and there was still no sign of Charley. Fake Charley Rosses continued to turn up all over the place, but Charley Ross was not in Brooklyn. He was not in the Bowery. Neither was he in Burke, Ithaca, Kingston, Ogdenburg, or Plattsburgh, New York, or Bordentown or Norristown, Pennsylvania, or Jersey City, Trenton, Camden, Morristown, Barnegat, or Merchantville, New Jersey. He was not in Berrysville, Virginia, Fairhaven, Connecticut, or Margaretville, Nova Scotia, and he definitely wasn't in Black River Falls, Minnesota, in the company of a mysterious woman who refused to remove her veil. Neither was he in the custody of Mr. James Cannon of St. Louis, who claimed to be an associate of Mosher's and offered to sell Ross some letters written in a cipher, which would reveal where Charley was being held. The directions hidden in Cannon's cipher turned out to be nonsense. Cannon himself turned out to be a con man with no actual connection to the case, and he was sent to the Hooskow. January came and went, and there was still no sign of Charley. His hat was finally found in Trenton on February 24th for the fat lot of good that did anyone now. Meanwhile, the Pennsylvania legislature passed the Charley Ross Law on February 25, 1875. It made kidnapping a felony. Yes, that's right. Despite the huge fuss kicked up over the previous 6 months, kidnapping was only a misdemeanor in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. The law also tacked on additional penalties for ransom, extortion, and child abduction. There was one exception codified in the bill: complete and utter amnesty for anyone who returned Charley Ross, provided it was done before March 25th. March 25th came and went, and there was still no sign of Charley. The public was getting antsy. Surely someone had to be punished for this dastardly crime. So the police tricked William Westervelt into visiting Philadelphia on the pretense of answering a few questions on their ongoing Charley Ross inquiry. Once he arrived in the city, he was promptly arrested and thrown in Moyamensing prison. Under repeated questioning, Westervelt broke down and finally told the truth. He hadn't been spying on Mosher and Douglas for the police. He'd been spying on the police for Mosher and Douglas. For 4 months, he consistently steered the cops in the wrong direction with outdated information, allowing his brother-in-law to get away with, well, kidnapping at the time, but now probably murder. When Westervelt finally went to trial in August 1875, the evidence against him was mixed. The Commonwealth had some difficulty tying him directly to the kidnapping. On the other hand, they had tons of information tying him to the ransom and extortion. There was Westervelt's own confession, witnesses who'd seen him escorting a boy who looked like Charley Ross, and even more witnesses who'd seen him consorting with Mosher and Douglas throughout the summer and fall. A travel itinerary that placed Westervelt at the places kidnappers had mailed letters from, and a notebook that definitely indicated Westervelt was coordinating the correspondence through the personals and may have been the primary author of the ransom notes. In the end, the jury found Westervelt innocent of the kidnapping, but convicted him for the ransom, extortion, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 7 years of confinement at Eastern State Penitentiary. I guess it's true. They don't get you for the crime. They get you for the cover-up. The Rosses never gave up the search for their missing boy. Fake Charley Rosses continued to pop up everywhere, but he was not in Brooklyn, New York, not in Boston, Massachusetts, nor was he in Towanda, Pennsylvania, Nashua, New Hampshire, Columbus or Tiffin, Ohio, St. Jean-Baptiste, Quebec, Louisville, Kentucky, Pittsburgh, Tennessee, Charleston, Mendon, or Wood River, Illinois, or Benton, Missouri, and he was definitely not in British Guyana. In 1878, P.T. Barnum approached Christian K. Ross with a proposal. He would offer a $10,000 reward for Charley and use his circus to get the word out, on the condition that after he was returned, Charley would become one of the prize attractions at the greatest show on earth. Surprisingly, Ross accepted, on the condition that he could just reimburse Barnum rather than let his child become a sideshow freak. After Gil Mosher's death, one of his sons claimed that a skeleton found in the basement of their old Grand Street oyster bar was that of Charley Ross, but it turned out to be the remains of a much older boy. In 1883, another Mosher brother tried to talk his way out of a lynching in Cheyenne, Wyoming, by claiming he knew where Charley Ross was hidden. It didn't work, and he got the noose. Christian K. Ross died in 1897, having spent his twilight years and most of his money in a vain attempt to find his missing child. The task of verifying Charley Ross claimants now fell on Walter Ross, who was a lot less polite about it than his father was. And he still had plenty of fakes to turn away. They seemed to come out of the woodwork on the significant anniversaries of the kidnapping, whenever one of the principals in the story died, or whenever there was another high-profile kidnapping case. Notable claimants came forward in 1897, 1900, 1906, 1911, 1915, 1922, and 1927. The last major claimant came forward in 1932, after the kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby. An Illinois carpenter named Gustav Blair claimed he was the long-lost Charley Ross, who had been hidden in a cave as a child, transported to Lee County, Illinois by the hitherto unnamed fourth kidnapper, and raised in secret to replace the dead child of a Midwestern farm family. He even had a cock and bull story to explain why he'd kept quiet for 50 years. In 1939, Blair somehow convinced an Arizona court to rubber stamp his claims, and then went off to grab his share of the Ross fortune. A fortune which didn't actually exist because Christian had spent it all looking for Charley. He had to fall back on Plan B, turning his life story into a screenplay and selling it to Hollywood. Tinseltown didn't bite. Gustav Blair died in 1943, still insisting to the end that he was Charley Ross. After the end, even, he had Charley Ross's name put on his gravestone. Walter Ross also died in 1943, and after his death the trickle of fake Charley Rosses finally came to an end. After all, Charley, if he was still alive, would have been 73 himself that year. If I were a betting man, I would wager that Charley never lived to see Christmas 1874. It seems likely that the fourth kidnapper killed the boy after Mosier and Douglas were shot in Bay Ridge, and then escaped scot-free. Far wiser minds have suggested that the fourth kidnapper was probably Martha Mosier, Bill's wife and Westervelt's sister, which makes a lot of sense. It would be easy to terrorize a shy, easily cowed boy like Charley into submission and hide him in a large, rowdy family like the Mosiers. It might also explain Westervelt's strangely weak defense strategy at trial. He may have been keeping quiet to keep the heat off his sister. While we may never know for sure what really happened to Charley Ross, there's a lot we can learn from how the case unfolded. Namely, that everyone involved bungled it from the start. The Philadelphia police were next to useless. They were well equipped to handle street-level crime, but had no idea how to handle something like a kidnapping. Here's a hint. Door-to-door searches aren't going to help, and neither will beating up hobos. The New York police were also useless. Even when they were explicitly told who the kidnappers were, they foolishly placed their trust in one bad apple and were sent on a wild goose chase that lasted for months. And don't even get me started on the Pinkertons. The advisory committee was actively unhelpful. They didn't care a lick for Charley Ross's safety, only the perception that the city was being tough on crime. The way they tried to draw out the negotiations only made it increasingly likely that Charley would be killed. The only reason they were able to get away with this strategy for so long is that the kidnappers were desperate for a payoff. The press wasn't helping things either. For months they published baseless speculation and wild rumors, and when they finally published actual facts, they were often old information presented out of order or in a misleading way. In the end, all they managed to accomplish was to confuse and dismay the family, the police, the public, and the kidnappers. While we're at it, let's not forget how badly the kidnappers bungled things. Not only did Mosier and Douglas target a family who couldn't meet their financial demands, their paranoia wound up making this whole operation several orders of magnitude more complex than it needed to be. If they'd done more research, or kept it simple, they could have had their money and been on their way. The only person I can think of who comes out of this untarnished is Christian K. Ross. Which isn't to say that he didn't make mistakes, because he certainly did. But his mistakes are those of a distraught parent, and therefore, I think, forgivable. I'd almost call the entire case a comedy of errors, except at the very end of it, there's a family left with a lifetime of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And very probably, a dead 4-year-old boy. Which isn't very funny. Key sources for this episode include Carrie Hagen's We Is Got Him, The Kidnapping That Changed America, Christian K. Ross's The Father's Story of Charley Ross, Norman J. Zierold's Little Charley Ross, America's First Kidnapping for Ransom, Tom Everly's Searching for Charley Ross, and contemporary news reports. Connections! If you're looking for other mysterious disappearances, why not try Series 8's Call Your Office, about the 1930 disappearance of New York Supreme Court Judge Joseph Forrest Crater, or Series 10's With Both Hands, about the 1976 disappearance of Key West Fire Chief Bum Fardo. Also, Westervelt isn't the first crook in our podcast to spend time in Philadelphia's legendary Eastern State Penitentiary. Other one-time residents of the prison have included Hex murderer John Blymeyer from Series 5's Bound in Mystery and Shadow, and Paul Jaworski, leader of Pittsburgh's Flathead Gang, from Series 6's The Terror of Gillikin Country. I am sorry if this episode seems a bit rough, initiates. It took a lot longer than anticipated to pull it together, and I am literally recording and editing this about 2 hours before it drops. In the end, though, I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. As a reward for your patience, I do have a nice bonus for you. At the very end of the episode, I touched on the story of Gustav Blair, but there's a lot more to his story. Was he a con man, or was he really Charley Ross? For years the answer has been, we'll never know. But now we have an answer. Next week I'll be posting an interview with Rod Miller, who along with his nephew Larry Miller, has helped to answer the question, who is Gustav Blair, once and for all? Look for that to hit your podcatcher next Monday. Until then, initiates, quid minime sciant, optime scire. This episode was produced by David White for the Ancient and Esoteric Order of the Jackalope and That's Not Canon Productions. Our theme song is Drama D by Scott Roosh. This episode is released under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 4.0 International License. All rights reserved, all wrongs reversed. The full script and sources of this episode can be found at orderofthejackalope.com. That's orderofthejackalope.com with hyphens between the words. Do you have thoughts about this episode? Why not head over to our Discord server and share them? There's a link in the show notes. Or reach out to us on social media. We can be found at Order Jackalope on Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, Reddit, and now Facebook. If social media is not your thing, you can always send us an old-fashioned email at jackalope@orderofthejackalope.com. We're looking for new lodge members. We'll initiate anyone into the secret mysteries. All you have to do is share a secret mystery of your own first. Go visit our website and click Join Us for more information.